The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Welcome to the Easton Grange. Today is June 16th, 2025, and I have a hint for all of you viewers on the top of my head tonight, and that is about our program, and it's going to be all about hats from different ages and periods, and it's going to be very exciting. We have our own Easton Lori Pyries here to give us a wonderful evening with talking about all kinds of hats, and you will be fascinated, as I have been in the past. I've heard it before. Lori Pyries, welcome.
Thank you.
And you don't need this. No. Okay, so take it away.
Oh, the hat? Thank you all for coming tonight. She did my introduction, so you all know my name is Lori Pyries. I'm going to talk about some of the hats in my collection. Hats have been around for a very long time. The first drawing of a hat dates back to a tomb wall in Thebes, Egypt. It dates back to 3100 BC. It showed a man wearing a conical-shaped hat. And then in 1991, I know we have a history teacher back there, some of you may have heard of Otzi the Iceman. Otzi the Iceman was found between the Austrian and Italian Alps. He is Europe's most well-preserved frozen mummy. And Otzi dates back between 3100 and 3400 BC. The reason I bring him up is because he was found wearing a bearskin hat. So hats have been around for a very long time. I actually started collecting when I was 11 years old. I read a book. There were many children's books about hats. And I happened to read a book about a boy that wore a different hat every day. And I thought that was interesting. And my parents took us down to Disney, and they bought me Mickey Mouse ears. And I thought, that's going to be the first hat in my collection. And now, well over 50 years later, I have over 500 pieces of headwear. So I'm going to talk about, again, some of the history and some of the stories of how I got some of these hats. They first came about, headwear, to protect you from the elements. The wind, the rain, the sun. Over time, they've come to represent fashion, style, and fun. When my kids were growing up, this was always their favorite hat, because it did this. Of course, hats also represent the military, occupations, train conductor, fire department, police, even the Schlitz beer driver had a hat. And do you remember when McDonald's workers wore these, or nurses wore these? I do like to point out the fire helmet. This is an old leather fire helmet. And although the materials have changed over the years, the design has stayed the same, with this elongated back to help protect these men and women doing a very difficult job. It keeps the sun and the rain off the backs of their necks, going down their jackets. Now, I walked the mail route for 27 years. There's not a lot of protection in this. In fact, many days I wish they didn't give us something like this. So before we get into some of the history, I'm going to tell you the story of how I obtained my French mail carrier's hat. My daughter and I were on vacation in France a few years back, and I had brought with me a United States of America hat in hopes of trading it with a mail carrier for a French mail hat. So the first day we went into a post office, and I talked to the clerk there. I asked her if I could meet up with a mailman there in the building. I wanted to make a trade for a hat. And she said, oh no, that's not possible. It's against the rules. It's in the manual. They can't sell or transfer any part of the uniform. A few days later, we were in a different little village, basically the same scenario. We went into a different post office, and the clerk behind the counter. It's against the law. They're not allowed to sell or transfer any part of the uniform. It's in the manual. Well, the last day of the trip, my daughter sees a mail carrier coming down the hill. Now, I can speak a little bit of French. I said, bonjour, je suis un facteur États-Unis, which is, hi, I'm a mail carrier in the United States. Well, I think he thought I was his long-lost sister. He hugged me, gave me a kiss on his cheek, and then explained that I would love his hat for my collection. And he, lucky for me, didn't read the manual. Handed me the hat. And I gave him the USA hat in return. And then twice more during the day, we're in this village, and we see this French mail carrier in full uniform with the United States of America hat on. That's one of the reasons why I collect headwear today. It's just some fun stories. The other reason is the history involved. I love history. I think my dad would have killed me if I didn't. But so I'm going to start with what I consider iconic hats in history. They've been around for hundreds of years and they're still around today. So the one Priscilla was wearing earlier, these styles, the flat cap, newsboy, scally cap, this dates back to the 1300s. In 1571, Parliament passed a law that every male over the age of 6 had to wear a woolen cap on Sundays and on holidays. The real reason was just to promote the wool trade. But the men got used to wearing it, so when the law was repealed about 25 years later, they continued wearing these. Well, when the Irish immigrants came to America, they brought the scally cap style with them. Now, a lot of these Irish immigrants worked along the shipyards and the docks, and they started getting a negative reputation for fighting, gambling, and such. So people began referring to them as scallywags, or scallywags, or scally caps. And that's the term we still have this style today. The next style of hat is one of my favorites, but this is an 1800s leather hat box. There's another one here, just to show what they, what the people went through to protect their headwear then. So this style of hat, again, one of my favorites, is the top hat. Initially, they were made from a beaver fur, and now a lot of them are made with a plush silk. But the top hat, in 1793, there was a gentleman by the last name of Dunnage. And Mr. Dunnage designed this style of hat, but not much really came about from it. So in 1797, there was another hatter, and his last name was Hetherington. So Mr. John Hetherington designed this style, and he wore it out of his shop in England down the main road. Well, the story says he caused such a commotion and such disturbance of peace that he was stopped by a police officer and fined for disturbing the peace. And at the same time, there was a reporter for the London Times that wrote the whole scenario up on the front page with a photograph of the hat. The rest, as they say, was history. Anyone that was anyone now wanted a top hat. Can anyone think of maybe someone in U.S. history that you can picture wearing a top hat?
Lincoln.
Hey, all right. President Lincoln, our 16th president, is well known for wearing the tallest of the three styles. He wore a stovepipe. And he was a lawyer by trade. He would put his important papers up inside his hat. Now, in 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated, the War Department, with his wife Mary's permission, took possession of a lot of his belongings. And it took about 2 years, but it was eventually the hat was donated to the Smithsonian Institute. The curator there felt it was still too soon, it was mine, so he actually just put it in a basement closet for almost 25 years, until eventually it was put out on display, which is where it sits today. So every U.S. president, including Kennedy, excluding Eisenhower before him, wore a top hat for the presidential inauguration. Kennedy's is actually on display if you're heading into Boston at the Kennedy Museum. On September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese boarded the USS Missouri to sign surrender papers after World War II, every non-military member of the Japanese delegation wore a top hat. J.P. Morgan had a specially made limousine with a tall roof, so he could ride around in it with his top hat on his head. There was nowhere to put the hat, so Mr. Gibbs modified the top hat. He put a spring inside where you could now knock it down and slide it under your seat. And these were known as opera hats or the Gibbs. This one's a little more torn up a bit, just so you can see the metal springs inside. Yeah. And I did a presentation last week, and when I got home that night, on Chronicle, they showed an old theater on the showroom, if anybody saw it, and in the theater, they had brackets under the seats that were, there's an old theater, that's exactly what they were for, about that. And of course, can't talk about the top hat, I'm talking about the Mad Hatter. So the Mad Hatter, the numbers on the side, 10/6, supposedly meant 10 shillings and 6 pence. The supposed price of his hat. Now my daughter went to a trivia night a year or so ago, and she came home and she said, Mom, the questions, she's come to several of these talks. Mom, the question was, what were the numbers on the side of the Mad Hatter's hat, and the bonus, what did they stand for? Well, she was all excited she got it right, and I was all excited to know she actually listens when I talk. Now the term Mad as a Hatter dates back to when hatters in Turkey would use camel fur to make headwear, and they would use the camel's urine to cure that fur. So you know, it makes that face. Well, that process made its way over to England and to Europe, and over time, rather than just using camel fur, they began using other animals' fur, and believe it or not, the hatters were using their own urine. Oh. So there was one factory in France where management noticed one gentleman who was working at a much quicker rate than the other workers. So when they looked into it, they found out that he was being treated for syphilis, and part of his medication was a form of mercury. So out with the urine, in with the mercury. Now these hatters who are working in windowless buildings, no vents, are working with mercury. They're literally being poisoned, and they're showing signs of shaking and forgetfulness, hence the term Mad as a Hatter. And in Connecticut, which was a huge hat town at one point, they have the term the Danbury Shakes for Danbury, Connecticut. 1849. I was told to talk quickly, so I'm doing my best here. In 1849, there was a wealthy landowner politician in England. The last name was Cook, but it was spelled C-O-K-E. Mr. Cook employed quite a few gentlemen. He would have them tend to the livestock and mend the fences when they rode a lot of horses throughout his property. But he wanted them dressed appropriately as gentlemen, and part of that attire included the top hat. However, top hat is not the most conducive piece of headwear when you're riding a horse. And he was constantly replacing them. So he went to the oldest hat company in the world, which is Lock & Company. They are on St. James Street in England. And he told the owner he wanted a hat that would fit tight on the gentleman's head with a much harder crown. And they gave the job to a couple of brothers whose last name was Bowler, and the Bowler was born. And Winston Churchill wore a bowler. This was considered the hat that won the West. If you look at any of the old Westerns, it's not like a cowboy hat. That had been invented yet. The old Westerns, you'll see the shopkeepers, the bartenders, they're wearing bowlers. And in fact, the bad guys, like Butch Cassidy, the good guys, all wearing bowlers, like Pat Masterson. What I found to be one of the funnier stories regarding the bowler, in the early 1920s, there were a group of English railroad workers working in Bolivia, laying railroad tracks. So shipments and shipments of bowlers were sent down to the workers. Well, when they opened the boxes, they were too small. Now, what do you do with hundreds of bowlers that don't fit the men? You tell the Quechuan women that this is high fashion in England. And they literally sold out, and this is a current day photograph. And the women with the beautiful skirts and the bright colored dresses. Again, this is current day. They're still wearing the bowlers. It's part of their outfit. A good salesman can sell anything.
How about the James Bond villain that was had the bowl with the weapon?
Yes, I wish I had that. In addition to, well, I should say in addition to, that's quite a few gentlemen's style. What were the women wearing? The women were wearing predominantly bonnets. They might have been different colors, different materials, but they were bonnets. In the late 1700s, this is actually the oldest piece in my collection. This is from 1790. There's a type of a bonnet called a calash. And women, of course, at this time had the tall wigs, so they needed a type of bonnet that could go up over their wig. So the calash, again, this is from 1790. The calash either had whalebone or wood, so that it could expand over the women's wigs. You're welcome to take a close look after too, but, so yeah, this is 1790 at its finest. When I did a talk a couple of years ago to Youth Sister State in Milton, and as a thank you, they toured Tim and I around their Haverhill offices, and it was all historical New England. It was amazing. They had artwork, and furniture, headwear, and clothing. And the curator was telling me that they had just had an appraiser come in. She was walking through the furniture section on her way to another part of the museum. And on her way through, there was, well, the appraiser said, "What is this item doing here?" And the curator said, "Well, it's the hood of a baby carriage," but they didn't give us the baby carriage. And this woman laughed and said, "No, it's a calash, the largest, most well-preserved calash I've ever seen." It was that big. And they had it in with the furniture because they thought it was part of the baby carriage. Wow. Now, Ed, I know you want to use your nightcap. You all are familiar, I'm sure, at a time when homes did not have heat. So the men and the women would put on nightcaps to go to bed. That's where the term, "let's have a nightcap," comes from a direct correlation. In addition to that, the women were also wearing, the women and the men were also wearing straw hats. This one is over 100 years old. This is from Foxborough, Massachusetts. At one point in time, I see someone nodding. At one point in time, Foxborough, Massachusetts was considered the straw hat capital of the world. And that is credited to a 12-year-old girl in 1798. Her name is Betsy Metcalf. And Betsy saw a straw hat bonnet in a window in Rhode Island. That's where she lived, in Rhode Island. And she, of course, fell in love with this bonnet, but she couldn't afford to purchase it. She was 12 years old. She taught herself how to braid straw until she braided it into a bonnet that she was happy with, and she wore it to her school in Rentham, Mass. Well, a lot of her classmates fell in love with it. Also asked her to teach them how to braid a hat. So she did. A lot of those girlfriends lived in Foxborough, Massachusetts, and a lot of them began making these hats and teaching sisters and moms. And this was a time when women didn't have their own money. They had no property. And here they were, only earning their own pocket money. So there was a gentleman in town called Mr. Carpenter, and Mr. Carpenter was buying up these hats, taking them into Boston and selling out on a daily basis. And eventually, this little cottage industry, he actually built a straw works factory, and they employed thousands of women and children to make these hats. And 1809, there was a woman named Mary Tice. Mary lived in Connecticut. She braided straw with silk to make these bonnets. So straw and silk, and eventually she applied for a patent. A woman couldn't own property, but nothing said they couldn't apply for a patent. And she was granted it, and Mary Tice was given the first patent for a woman in the United States, and it had to do with braiding hats, straw and silk. Also in the late 1800s, the Grange was built on Washington Street, right, Ed? Okay. I think 1895?
Yeah.
All right, so a year after that, 1896, there were a lot of milliners. Milliners made women's hats, and hatters made men's hats. So there were a lot of milliners in the late 1896 at this point that were using feathers to make hats. I mean, you walk down the streets of London, Boston, Europe, anywhere, and you would see storefronts filled with hats with feathers. They had whole birds on them. They had big wings. And in 1896, there were two cousins, Hall and Hemingway. They got together and decided to boycott millinery that used feathers because they were looking into this. And for an example, there were 90% of the white egrets wiped out in Florida for millinery purposes. 90%. They all flew plumage. So they hosted tea parties. They were part of the Blue Bloods of Boston area. They hosted these tea parties, and they got a lot of women to join with them. And that was how the Massachusetts Audubon Society was born. And eventually became the Mass Audubon eventually became Audubon Society in the country. And also treaties like the Bird Treaty, so they couldn't transfer birds across state lines, all from these women having to do with millinery. Now, still in the late 1800s, there was a play written for the stage actress Sarah Bernhardt. You guys heard of Sarah Bernhardt? So Sarah Bernhardt played a character in the play where she wore a soft style felt hat. Her name in the play was Princess Fedora. So the fedora was born, and it was actually first made and marketed for women. It wasn't until around 1924 when there was a prince in England that wanted this is not from 1924, but when a prince in England decided he liked the style of the fedora, he wanted a manly version, if you will, and I'm sure you can picture the 1920s Prohibition, and you think of the gangsters, Al Capone, all wearing fedoras. They even made them for little kids. So 1920, women get the right to vote. They started to feel a little bit of freedom. They cut their hair short. It was like the cloche style, this short style hat, fit over their short hairstyles. So women are wearing a cloche, men are in the fedoras, very popular time for headwear. There are a lot of different milliners at this time also in the 1800s into the 1900s. There's only three that I want to point out to you. This is Elsa Schiaparelli. Now Elsa was born in Italy. Can you tell by my accent? Elsa was born in Italy, and she was considered the top designer between the two world wars. She did a lot of crazy, shocking things. She did a dress that Salvador Dali drew a lobster on. She invented a pocketbook with a rotary dial on it. Elsa also, when a woman would wear a dress, Elsa had it so that if it was a yellow dress, the zipper was yellow. So she coordinated things, but she also designed with Salvador Dali a high-heeled shoe hat that was upside down on your head. And when France declared war in Germany in 1939, September 3rd, she fled to the States with her husband. They had a daughter. And after the war was over, they had gotten divorced, but Elsa did move back to Paris, hoping to resurrect, if you will, her shop. But unfortunately, it was went into the early 50s, and her style was no longer viable. There were people like Christian Dior on the scene doing like a turban style hat. Elsa, however, the Schiaparelli name was repurchased in 2012, so it's back on the forefront in Europe for high society. Now, she had a daughter I mentioned. Her daughter had 2 daughters. One of them married Anthony Perkins. In fact, the Psycho movie, I think, is 65 years old today. It's nodding yes. So she was married to Anthony Perkins. She, however, this particular daughter, Barry, did not live long enough to see her grandmother's name brought back to life. She was on vacation down the Cape and was heading home to California when her plane hit the World Towers. So that was one of Elsa's granddaughters. But in the 50s, when Elsa was closing up her shop, there was another milliner in the States. He was born in Germany, Mr. John. Mr. John was the designer to the stars. Now, Mr. John, I found him to be a pretty fun character. A woman walked into his shop in New York and demanded a hat. I need a hat right now, immediately, for a special event. He said, okay, just a minute. He had her sit. He literally built the hat while she waited. Then he gave her the price. She complained it was too much money. Mr. John said, just a minute. He disassembled it. He handed her the pieces. He said, $3.59, you build it. When he was in 1993, he was 91 years old, and he's quoted as saying on his deathbed, I don't know what I'll do when I get to heaven, because I don't think even I can improve on the halo. The last milliner I want to mention worked at a store called One Way Teller. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. Okay, it's similar to like a Macy's, I guess. And in milliner named Ann Dinkin. And this hat my mom actually got me at a yard sale. And what I love about it is it came with a provenance. So in 1947, after World War II, Ann Dinkin and her husband moved to Japan. In Japan, she was still making and selling her hats back to the States. So this particular hat is checked off, and there's a little note from Ann saying, if you choose the bonnet of your liking, I will mail it to you. I will make it and mail it to you. $18.50 to make it and mail it from Japan, whereas, just as an example, in today's world, this hat was $450. And so this was $18. Now, trying to research information on Ann Dinkin, I couldn't find anything. I kept finding Jewish delicatessen owner. So, come to find out, it's the same person. When Ann was in Japan, and her husband and her got divorced, she decided she needed to do something more than just make some hats and sell them back to the States. It wasn't making enough money. So she applied and was granted the very first Jewish delicatessen in Japan, and she managed to get exclusive rights to import pastrami. She then said she also taught her employees to be rude, just like a real Jewish deli in New York. She said that way no one could steal my employees away from me. So these are all, again, through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. This is a picture, sorry, Mom's in this one. This is a picture from the 1950s. It just shows the kids, the adults, everybody's wearing a hat. And they'd go into the circus. So, like, this is 1950, and hats were at their heyday, if you will. Now, what happened in the 60s? 1960. Who said it? Somebody said it. Hatless Jack. Mr. Kennedy, President Kennedy, was not a fan of headwear. So, for women at this time, they're teasing their hair, they're coloring their hair. That's now becoming their fashion statement. In notice hats and headwear have a direct correlation. When women had the tall wigs, they had a bonnet or a collage. When 1920, they started to cut their hair short, they were a cloche. Well, now this is their hairstyle, is their headwear, their hair itself. So that was a demise for women. And again, the men, a lot of it was attributed to President Kennedy. You had hat companies mailing him headwear on a daily basis, begging him to wear them, but he wouldn't do it. Because they had a meeting one time, and the president of all the hat companies was holding up a photo of Kennedy saying, how do we change this? He doesn't wear a hat. And then he had one of Gorbachev with a hat. He's like, guys, we have to change his attitude. But it just didn't work. He was on the campaign trail. It started to rain, and he ducked into a store and purchased a hat. And the front page of the paper the next day said, Jack bought a hat. Really big deal. So, and the women in 60s, late 60s, talk about lazy, they wear one of these. My grandmother with these. It's called a whimsy. But this is it, guys. This is what headwear was at in the 70s. It was the worst time for headwear. But can anybody guess what movie in 1981 wore a fedora? Harrison Ford? Oh,
Indiana Jones.
yes, Indiana Jones. 1981, Indiana Jones. And, I mean, what man wouldn't want to emulate Indiana Jones, right? So fedoras took off in popularity again. It became mainstream for headwear. And even today, if you think of musicians and anybody up on stage, really, a lot of them wear fedoras. The women, also 1981, Princess Diana. Princess Diana was considered a people person. The women loved her. They wanted to emulate her. They began wearing hats more often. So the 80s, and I say it to the current day, everybody looks great in a hat. When I was on a plane years ago with my kids, and we were in New Zealand, and the first thing I noticed was this guy's, the first thing I noticed wasn't the hat, but eventually I noticed this guy's hat. And of course, it's New England Patriots, but he had no idea who the New England Patriots were. He lived in New Zealand. He said, I got it on sale in England. But it's a great conversation. But I say, wear a hat, guys. Everybody looks good. So we're gonna zip right here and jump over to, again, everybody looks good in a hat, keep wearing them. If you remember when the Patriots were going to move the stadium, they were going to move to St. Louis and become the Stallions. And they actually made hats up. They were supposed to be destroyed. If you go to the Patriots Museum in Foxborough, they do have a Stallion shirt, but they don't have a hat. So I'm holding out for season tickets. Now, okay, Super Bowl 37. Both these hats say Super Bowl 37 champions. Does anybody know which team won? Any football people? Okay. Tampa Bay beat the Raiders, but they obviously made up both hats, and this one was supposed to be destroyed, but I just thought it was kind of interesting to see both the champion. And a side note, the year before the Super Bowl, the Raiders fired their coach. Guess where he went? A little bit of retribution here. At this point, I'll be showing off some of my collection. German World War I, called Pickelhaube. It's 1915 Berlin engraved underneath with the gentleman's initials. This is artillery, and in 1916, a lot of these were actually recalled, and the Germans cut the point off, and then they just restamped the leather 1916 and reissued them. They found out this was not the best item to put on top of the hat. Years ago, when my daughter went to Spain, and I asked her, the only thing I'm asking for is if you can find me an authentic hat. Spain and Portugal, like Iberian Peninsula, they wear this style hat with their outfits, and of course, bullfighters. a year later, I'm up in Maine at an antique store, and I find it. So I come home with it. Sorry, Mom, but my mom says, well, "Why did you buy Mickey Mouse ears?" Okay. This is a Chinese mouth. The hat itself is all hand embroidered, and then the silver is all hand hammered. So it's usually adorned with birds and feathers. And then Maui women wear them for weddings and festivals. Now, this hat I got from Martha's Vineyard. There was, well, I had a few minor surgeries. And so two of my best friends decided they're gonna cheer me up and take me to Martha's Vineyard. And we went to Edgartown. And, I saw this hat in the window. Well, obviously I fell in love with it. But, excuse me, where's it from? I got it from, it's Mao, M-I-A-O, China.
Oh, China.
But I got it in the vineyard.
Yes.
And so my two best friends, they talked me out of buying it. They said, look, you can't afford that right now. And they were right, so I didn't get it. But I thought about it for the next 3 days. And then I called my boyfriend Tim and I said, hey, you want to go to the vineyard for the day? And we did. Now fast forward about 10 years and I'm delivering my mail route in Mansfield, Mass. And a new shop moved onto my route called Leaf Boutique. And her name is Leaf, very nice, and we're talking, and of course, we're on the subject of headwear. And I started describing a hat as some of my favorite hats. This was one of them. And she said to me, without me saying anymore, she said, I know what it looks like and I know where you got it. I said, how can you possibly know that? It was her mother's shop in Edgartown that I got the hat from. It's a small world. In the 40s, these were very popular. They call them salesman samples. I don't know why they use that reference. These are exact replicas of full hat boxes. And inside, they were actually gift certificates. Inside is the hat that you would purchase for the gentleman. And you would take this to the shop, and they would make the hat that you would purchase. Oh, one down a bit. This one is Iroquois Indian. Again, all hand beaded here. They would make these and sell them to the tourists up at Niagara Falls. There's a lot of work there.
Yes.
And again, you're welcome to take a closer look at that. This one. This was in Ringling Brothers Farnham Bailey Circus. It's close to 100 years old now. Researching this one, it had a tag inside that led me to a shop in New York that made headwear for theater as well as for the circus. And then it had somebody's name in it, and her name, I don't know if that's on, Bonnie. And this is actually a photo of her and her twin sister. They did acrobatics, I should say, for Ringling Brothers Circus. And in the photo, they're holding like a little, right, they're holding hats, and you can see the little tinge of green in it. And a friend of mine took care of a gentleman that worked for the Ringling Brothers Circus for about 90 years. He passed away, he was over 100 years old, and he had gifted some of his items to my friend who gifted this to me. All right, just take 3 more things. So, this is my alma mater, Stoneville College, and this shows a gentleman wearing these college beanies. They call them deeks or beanies, and the freshmen had to wear these, and upperclassmen would quiz them about the school. They think the demise of this type of hat happened when the men were coming back from war and going to college. There's no way they would have put one of these on their head. Alrighty. This is very unique. These are Amish.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when the infant is born, they put on the white. And then this is unique because it's like the Russian nesting dolls, if you will. So it's all the different sizes. When they get married, the women, again, go back to a white bonnet. But meanwhile, and it has her name in it, Amanda. And I saw this 2 years ago at Brookfield at the antique show. And I walked into the booth and I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like this, so well put together and such. So I kind of nonchalant asked the gentleman, I said, oh, what are these, bonnets? And his answer was, yeah, my wife got those. Who'd want bonnets? Yes. So he probably got yelled at when she got back. All right, I'm going to end it with my favorite story. This is my Bermuda police hat, and my dad got me this like 50 years ago. He was in Bermuda on vacation, and he went up to the police officer, and he asked him, where'd you get your hat? And the police officer said, well, they're issued, let's say, Mr. Smith, at the armory. So Dad hailed a cab, and he said, I need to go to the armory. And the cabbie said, well, I can't take you there, that's off limits. My father said, well, how far can you get me? He said, well, I can just get you to the outside of it. Dad said, sure, let's go. So off they went, and they get to the gates, and out comes a soldier with his machine gun, and my dad's in the back seat, and starts rolling down the window. And the gentleman pokes his head in, he says, what are you doing here? My father says, oh, Joe Muratori from the United States of America, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. And he said, oh, all right, and he opened the gate. So they proceeded, and my dad telling me the story, it says the back of his neck is shaking up with sweat. And the cabbie's saying, he'll be in here. My father said, you can complain about it, let us in. So they get to the second gate, same scenario, same thing, Joe Muratori from the United States of America, and the gentleman with the machine gun, okay, let him in. So now they get to the base of the stairs, and my father says to the cabbie, look, I'll make it worth your while. Just wait here for me, I'll be back. So Dad goes inside, up the stairs, into the building, talks to the secretary, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. Oh, have a seat, I'll let him know you're here. A few minutes later, she gets my dad, she says, all right, come on in, Mr. Smith, we'll see you now. So they exchange pleasantries, and Mr. Smith says, well, Mr. Muratori, what can I do for you? Okay. My father says, well, I want to get my daughter a hat for her collection. Mr. Smith says, how did you get in here? My father says, let us in at the gate. So Mr. Smith then says, for the sheer fact that you got here in front of me today, I am going to get you a hat. And my dad, not being pushy, with a badge and everything, they said, yes, Mr. Smith. Yes, Mr. Muratori, with a badge and everything. So my dad then said, well, that's great. Now, what can I do for you? And Mr. Smith said, Mr. Muratori, you've done more than enough. You told me I need to upgrade my security.